The first thing to hit Jedediah Stone was the smell, acrid and oily, the scent of a world coming undone. It clawed at the back of his throat, a foul cocktail of burning hay, scorched pine, and the panicked sweat of terrified animals. He spurred his horse Jericho over the last rise, and the scene exploded into view, a vision torn from a fever dream. Bitter Ridge was bleeding fire into the twilight sky. The town's livery stable, its proudest structure aside from the half-finished courthouse, was a roaring inferno. Flames, brilliant and cruel, licked at the bruised purple of the evening, devouring the roof and spitting embers into the wind like angry hornets. The roar was a living thing, a primal beast swallowing the panicked shouts of men and the high gut-wrenching screams of horses trapped within. The sun beat down on the cracked earth, turning the horizon into a shimmering mirage where the sky bled into the dust, but here the fire created its own violent sunset. Jed didn't hesitate. Years of instinct honed by a life chasing ghosts across a lawless frontier took over. He swung down from Jericho before the horse had even skidded to a halt, his worn leather dusters swirling around him. The bucket brigade was a mess of flailing limbs and terrified yells, a study in chaos. Men tripped over one another, sloshing more water onto the dusty ground than onto the blaze. Form 2 lines. Jed's voice was a gravelly roar that cut through the din and the command of a man used to being obeyed. One to the pump, one to the fire, move with a purpose. Some of the men, wild-eyed and lost, stared at him. Others, recognizing the solid, unshakable core of authority in his presence, immediately fell into place. He grabbed a bucket, his hands sure and steady, and joined the end of the line, his movements economical and powerful. The heat was a physical blow, searing his skin and drying the air in his lungs. Then he saw her. Through the shifting curtains of smoke and human panic, she stood isolated, a small island in a sea of accusation. A Cherokee woman, her face smudged with soot, her black hair a stark slash against the buckskin of her dress. Her hands were held out, palms open, a gesture of peace that was being utterly ignored. The crowd pressed in on her, their faces contorted with fear and rage. A large, beefy man with a blacksmith's apron jabbed a thick finger in her direction, his voice a raw bellow. She did it. I saw her skulking around back just before the smoke started. The woman's name was Anaba. Jed had seen her in town before trading herbs and remedies with the doctor. She was quiet, her eyes holding a deep, sorrowful wisdom that seemed out of place in a town as raw as Bitter Ridge. And then the scent of burning pine, sharper and more resinous than the hay, hit him. The world tilted. The roar of the fire in front of him faded, replaced by a different roar from a decade past. The shouts of Bitter Ridge's citizens became the screams of a woman and her children. The Wyoming night dissolved into the suffocating blackness of a Colorado forest, and the air thick with the smell of a burning log cabin. He was there again, a younger man in a U.S. Marshal's duster, his lungs full of smoke, his heart a cold, hard knot of failure in his chest. A lamp knocked over in a gunfight. A family, the Vances, caught in the middle. He remembered the inferno, the way the flames had seemed to mock him, devouring the home with an insatiable hunger. He remembered pulling a small, sobbing boy from the wreckage, the child's face a mask of ash and tears. Caleb. He had saved one, but he had failed 4 others. A raw scream from a dying horse snapped him back to the present. The memory receded, leaving the familiar ghost of guilt clinging to him like a shroud. He looked from the fire to Anaba, trapped by the mob. He saw the same blind, senseless blame that had haunted his own soul for years. From the edge of the chaos, standing in the shadow of the general store's awning, another man watched. Silas Kane. He was new to Bitter Ridge, a man of wealth and quiet influence, who dressed in tailored Eastern suits that seemed immune to the dust and grime of the West. While others fought the fire or joined the mob, Kane was perfectly still, his handsome face a mask of calm observation. His eyes cold and intelligent, flickered from the fire to Annaba, and then for a brief, penetrating moment, they met Jed's. In that fleeting glance, Jed felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling night. It was the dispassionate curiosity of a man watching a game of chess, a game he was already certain he had won. Jed looked away, his jaw tight. The fire in the stable was an enemy he could fight. The fire in the town's heart, stoked by fear and suspicion, was another matter entirely. The sun rose on a skeleton. Where the livery had stood was now a blackened rib cage of charred timbers, a smoldering wound in the center of town. The air, thick with the lingering stench of ruin, hung heavy over Bitter Ridge. Dust devils danced in the main street, listless and gray, and the saloon's piano, usually a source of raucous life, sounded like a ghost's lament. Jedediah Stone stood at the edge of his small ranch, miles from the town's suffocating grief. The land here was his sanctuary, a place of stark, quiet beauty. The sun beat down on the cracked earth, turning the horizon into a shimmering mirage, where the sky bled into the dust. He had come here seeking silence, a place where the ghosts of his past might finally quiet their whispering. For 2 years it had almost worked. He ran a calloused hand over Jericho's flank, the horse's warmth a small comfort. He was no longer a U.S. Marshal. He had turned in his badge the day after he'd buried the Vances. The official report was a clean, sterile document, a fugitive gang, a necessary gunfight, a tragic accident. It omitted the crucial details, the tremor in his hand, as he'd faced the gang's leader, the moment of hesitation that had allowed the lamp to be overturned, the suffocating finality of the flames. It omitted the face of 12-year-old Caleb Vance, the sole survivor, whose vacant, accusing eyes were seared into Jed's memory. They had sent the boy to an orphanage back east, a place they promised would heal him. Jed knew better. Some wounds never healed, they just festered. He had traded his Colt Peacemaker for a branding iron, his Marshal Star for the solitude of the open range. But the fire had brought it all back. The past wasn't buried, it was just sleeping. Back in Bitter Ridge, the town's self-appointed leaders were gathered in the sheriff's office. The room was small, smelling of stale coffee and desperation. Sheriff Brody, a man whose weary face was a roadmap of compromises, leaned heavily on his desk. His badge was dull, his spirit worn thin by the daily attrition of frontier life. He was a good man, but he was out of his depth, a swimmer caught in a current too strong to fight. The whole town's howling for blood, Jed Brody said, not looking up from the wanted posters he was shuffling. They want the Indian girl. They want a hanging. What they want and what's right are two different things, Eli Jed said, his voice low. Also in the room were Doc Miller and Silas Kane. The doc, a man whose gentle hands and pragmatic mind had mended more of the town's wounds than the sheriff ever could, looked worried. There's no proof. None. Just a woman in the wrong place at the wrong time. Silas Kane, however, was the picture of calm reason. He sat in a chair by the window, his posture relaxed, his dark suit immaculate. Gentlemen, he began, his voice smooth and cultured, a stark contrast to the rough-hewn tones of the others. Fear is a powerful motivator. The people have lost their homes, their livestock. They need to feel that justice is being served, swiftly. He wasn't advocating for a lynching, not in so many words. He was merely articulating the mob's desire, giving it the veneer of logic. He used words like weapons, wrapping threats in the silk of civility. Justice isn't a feeling, Kane, Jed countered, his gaze fixed on the man. It's a fact. You find it, you don't invent it. Kane offered a thin, knowing smile. An admirable sentiment, Mr. Stone. But out here, sentiment can get a man killed. I'm simply a businessman invested in the prosperity and, more importantly, the stability of this town. His investment was on display all over the county. Kane had been buying up land ranches and water rights with a quiet, relentless efficiency. He promised progress, a railroad spur, a future. But those who refused to sell found their wells mysteriously running dry or their fences cut. Stability, it seemed, was something Kane defined on his own terms. Meanwhile, Annaba sat on a thin cot in the town's single jail cell. The space was cold, smelling of damp stone and despair. She was not afraid, not in the way the men outside were. Her fear was a deeper, more ancient thing, the weary resignation of a people who had learned that justice was a word that rarely applied to them. She had been gathering yarrow and willow bark in the woods along the creek when the sky began to glow. She had run toward the light, not away from it, her first instinct to help. For that she was now a caged animal, the focus of a town's collective terror. When Jed had looked at her through the smoke, his eyes holding not accusation, but a familiar shared pain, she had felt the first flicker of something other than despair. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was something far more fragile, the recognition of a fellow soul haunted by fire. Night fell again, but it brought no peace. A whiskey-fueled rage, fanned by whispers and lies, was coalescing in the smoky confines of the saloon. Kane's men were at the heart of it. The biggest and loudest was a man named Fletcher, a hulking brute with a permanent sneer and fists like granite blocks. He moved through the crowd, his words poison, painting Annaba as a savage agent of chaos, a threat to their very existence. "The sheriff ain't gonna do nothin'," Fletcher roared, slamming his mug on the bar. "He'll let that witch sit in her cell until some fancy judge from Cheyenne comes and sets her free. We need to handle this ourselves. Bitter Ridge justice." The cry was taken up by others. The simmering fear of the day boiled over into a lynch mob. They poured out of the saloon, a dark, surging river of men armed with ropes, torches, and self-righteous fury. Jed was checking on Cherokee in the temporary corral behind the blacksmith shop when he heard them. It was a sound he knew too well, the ugly guttural roar of a mob that had convinced itself its hate was holy. He didn't run. He walked his steps, deliberate, his face set like stone. He moved not toward the sound, but to intercept it, planting himself directly in the path between the mob and the jailhouse. The torchlight cast demonic shadows on the men's faces, twisting them into masks of raw, unthinking violence. They saw him and faltered their momentum, broken by the sight of this one solitary man standing against them. "Get out of the way," Stone Fletcher bellowed, pushing to the front. "This ain't your business." "You make it my business when you decide to trade the law for a rope." Jed's voice was quiet, yet it carried over the angry murmurings. "She burned the stable. She's a killer," someone shouted from the back. Jed's eyes swept over the crowd, meeting the gaze of men he knew, men who had shared a drink with him, men whose children he'd seen born. "You don't know that. All you know is you're scared. And you're letting this man," he nodded toward Fletcher, "use that fear to turn you into something you're not." For a moment there was a flicker of doubt in their eyes. But Fletcher was ready. "He's one of them, an Indian lover. He's protecting her so she can burn the rest of our town down around us." The mob surged forward again, their brief moment of conscience extinguished. Jed held his ground. He didn't reach for the gun holstered at his hip. That would only escalate the violence. He stood a bulwark of pure, unyielding will. Just as the first men reached him, the door of the sheriff's office opened. Sheriff Brody stood there, a shotgun held loosely in his hands. He looked terrified, but Jed's presence had ignited a dying ember of his duty. "That's enough," he yelled, his voice cracking. "Go home. This is a matter for the law." The standoff was broken by the arrival of Silas Kane. He moved through the mob, not like a leader, but like a master returning to his kennel. The men parted for him, their anger dimming in his cold, authoritative presence. He stopped before Jed, his expression one of mild disappointment. Mr. Stone Kane set his voice a silken thread in the tense air. A noble display. Truly. But perhaps misguided. The people require a release for their anger. They require the truth. Jed said, his eyes locked on Kane's. And I'm going to find it. Are you now? Kane's lips curled into a smile that did not reach his eyes. He turned to the crowd. My friends, he announced, his voice resonating with false empathy. Mr. Stone, in his wisdom, has invoked the law. He has taken it upon himself to see justice done. He believes the woman is innocent. Let us grant him this chance. He made it sound like a generous concession, but it was a declaration of war. He was isolating Jed, making him the sole guardian of the accused. If Jed failed, the mob's wrath would be directed not just at Anaba, but at him as well. Kane had placed the burden squarely on Jed's shoulders. He had handed Jed the rope and was now daring him to hang himself with it. The crowd, placated for the moment, began to disperse, muttering and casting dark looks at Jed. The immediate threat was over, but a far more dangerous one had just begun. The investigation began in the ashes. Under a pale, indifferent sun, Jed sifted through the debris of the livery, the bitter smell of char clinging to his clothes. Sheriff Brody stood by, a reluctant observer, while Doc Miller offered what little help he could. The town watched from a distance, their gazes like small, sharp stones. Jed was an outsider now, a pariah protecting one of their own kind's supposed enemies. He found it near the back wall where the fire had burned hottest. A single partial boot print pressed deep into a patch of damp earth that had been protected from the worst of the flames. The heel had a distinctive star-shaped pattern worn into the leather. It was a small thing, but it was a start. He pointed it out to Brody, who grunted in acknowledgement. But when Jed returned an hour later with a measuring stick, the print was gone. The entire area had been trampled, then the earth churned into a meaningless mess of mud and ash. A few of Kane's men were helping clear the debris nearby, their faces impassive. Jed knew it was no accident. The hostility was a palpable thing. When he tried to question the blacksmith who had first accused Anaba, the man spat on the ground and turned his back. Doors were closed quietly but firmly in his face. The people of Bitter Ridge had drawn a line, and Jed and Anaba were on the wrong side of it. They spoke of him in whispers, their fear curdling into resentment. He was the man who had stood with a savage against them. That evening, as he walked down a dark alleyway on his way to the doctor's office, the threat became physical. Two shadows detached themselves from the deeper darkness. It was Fletcher and another of Kane's hired guns. Evening Stone. Fletcher growled, blocking his path. Mr. Kane, he's a patient man. He thinks you should be too. He thinks maybe you should stop kicking over ashes. Might find something you don't want. Is that what he thinks? Jed said, his body going still, every sense on high alert. That's what he thinks, Fletcher confirmed, cracking his knuckles. We think you should just ride on out. Leave the squaw to her fate. It'd be healthier for you. Jed's reply was silence. He took a half-step back, a subtle shift of weight. Fletcher took it as retreat and lunged, his massive fist swinging for Jed's head. But Jed wasn't there. He moved with a speed that belied his size, sidestepping the blow and driving the heel of his hand into Fletcher's throat. The big man gagged, stumbling backward. The second man drew a knife, its blade glinting in the moonlight. Jed didn't give him the chance to use it. He kicked the man's knee, the crack of bone echoing in the narrow alley, and a follow-up blow sent him crashing into a stack of empty crates. Fletcher came at him again, roaring with rage. This time the fight was brutal and short. Jed absorbed a heavy blow to his ribs that stole his breath, but he returned it with a series of precise, punishing strikes to the man's face and body. The work of a man who knew exactly how to dismantle an opponent. Fletcher crumpled to the ground, wheezing and bloody. Jed stood over them, his chest heaving. He hadn't wanted this, but he wouldn't back down from it. "Tell Kane," he rasped, his voice tight with pain, "that I'm not going anywhere." He straightened his duster and walked away, leaving the two men groaning in the dirt. He was no longer just an investigator. He was a target. And he knew with a cold certainty that Kane's next move would be far more subtle and far more deadly. The jail cell was a cage of shadows and silence. Jed pulled up a stool, the only furniture in the small office besides the sheriff's desk, and looked at Anaba through the iron bars. Her face in the dim lantern light was calm, her hands resting quietly in her lap. She possessed a stillness that seemed to defy the cold stone walls around her. "They think I am a ghost," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Something to be afraid of, because I am not like them. It is easier to fear what you do not understand." "I'm trying to understand," Jed said. "Tell me what happened, everything you saw." Her story was simple and unadorned. She had been by the creek, as she had told him before, gathering herbs for Doc Miller. The glow in the sky drew her. As she neared the town's edge, she saw two men running from the back of the livery. It was too dark to see their faces, but one was very large, and the other moved with a slight limp. They vanished into the darkness just as the first tongues of flame became visible. She had run toward the fire to raise the alarm, and in doing so had run directly into the arms of the town's panic. An alliance, unspoken, but deeply felt, formed in that small, grim room. It was an alliance of outcasts, bound by a shared sense of injustice. Jed saw in her not a savage or a victim, but a survivor, her resilience, a quiet rebuke to the loud, empty rage of the town. His next stop was Doc Miller's infirmary. The place smelled of carbolic acid and whiskey, a scent of healing and hard truths. The doctor was cleaning his instruments, his face etched with worry. "You'll want to be careful," Doc Miller warned, not looking up from his work. "This town is a powder keg, and Silas Kane is holding the match." "I know," Jed said. Anaba saw two men, one large one with a limp. The doctor paused, his hands freezing over a scalpel. He slowly looked up, his eyes meeting Jed's. "The night of the fire," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Fletcher brought one of his men to me. A fellow named Peters. Claimed he'd twisted his ankle falling down the saloon stairs. It was a bad sprain. He'll be limping for a week." He then added Peters also had a fresh burn on his forearm, a nasty one. Said he got it from a cooking fire. I didn't believe him then, and I surely don't believe him now. It was the first solid piece of evidence, a thread that connected Kane's men directly to the fire. The next day, Jed positioned himself across the street from the saloon, watching. He saw Fletcher emerge, his face a swollen, bruised testament to their encounter in the alley. The man wore a new pair of boots, but the ones he'd had on the night before were likely the same ones that had left the star-shaped print in the mud. Then Peters hobbled out, his limp pronounced, his arm wrapped in a bandage. The pieces were fitting together. Later that afternoon, his path crossed with Silas Kane's on the main boardwalk. The man was all smiles and civility, a predator cloaked in fine wool. Mr. Stone Kane greeted him warmly. "I do hope your investigation is proving fruitful. The town is most anxious for a resolution." As Kane spoke, he idly reached into his waistcoat pocket and pulled out a small object, tossing it from one hand to the other. It was a small, intricately carved, wooden bird, its wings half spread as if in mid-flight. The craftsmanship was exquisite. and the sight of it hit Jed like a physical blow. His mind flashed back again to the smoldering ruins of the Vance cabin. He remembered the small scorched toys scattered in the dirt. He remembered Mr. Vance, a quiet farmer and a gifted whittler, telling Jed how he carved little birds for his son Caleb to ward off bad dreams. One of them had looked exactly like this. The blood ran cold in his veins. A coincidence it couldn't be. It was a message, a taunt. Cain wasn't just a land grabber orchestrating a fire. He was a ghost from Jed's past, and he was playing a game only the two of them understood. Jed strode directly to the telegraph office, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The air inside was thick with the scent of ozone and the rhythmic clatter of the machine. He scribbled a message on a slip of paper, his hand surprisingly steady. It was addressed to Marcus Thorne, Deputy Marshal in Cheyenne, a man Jed had trusted with his life more than once. Marcus, urgent. Need info on man named Silas Cain. Operating Bitter Ridge. Also pull file, Vance Homestead Tragedy. Colorado. 10 years ago. Look for any connection. Survivor named Caleb. Reply soonest, Jedeo. He handed the slip to the young operator, a nervous man named Miller, who flinched under Jed's intense gaze. Send it, Jed ordered. And you tell me the second a reply comes in. No one else. The operator nodded, his eyes wide. As Jed left, he saw the young man glance nervously out the window toward the building across the street and the new office of the Bitter Ridge Development Company, owned and operated by Silas Cain. The trap was closing in, and Jed knew he was running out of time. The wait was a form of torture. For 2 days, Jed moved through Bitter Ridge like a phantom, every nerve stretched taut. The telegraph office remained silent. In that silence, Cain's power grew. He finalized the purchase of the last independent ranch in the valley, his control of the region now nearly absolute. The townspeople, seeing his inexorable rise, grew more fearful, their hostility toward Jed hardening into a conviction that he was a dangerous fool disrupting the town's fragile peace for the sake of a worthless Indian. Jed spent the time watching, gathering the threads. He confirmed that Peters, the man with the limp and the burn, had been paid a handsome bonus by Cain the day after the fire. He saw Fletcher distributing new rifles to Cain's core group of enforcers. This wasn't just about a land grab anymore. It was about building an army. On the third day, the telegraph operator found him. The young man Miller was pale and sweating, his hands trembling as he held out a sealed envelope. It came through an hour ago, Mr. Stone. He stammered, refusing to meet Jed's eye. I came as soon as I could. Jed took the envelope, his fingers tearing it open. The staccato print of the telegraph message was stark against the yellow paper. He read it once, then again, the world narrowing to the black ink on the page. Jed, no record of any Silas Cain. Checked Vance tragedy file as requested. Sole survivor, Caleb Vance. Age 12, sent to St. Jude's Orphanage, Boston. Escaped 2 years later. No trace since. Federal warrant issued for his later activities is sealed, but source says it involves extortion fraud. Description from orphanage matches your man. Height, hair, eyes. Distinctive scar above left eyebrow. Be advised, Jedi. He is considered extremely dangerous and manipulative. Marcus. Jed's breath hitched. A scar above the left eyebrow. He'd seen it on Cain, a faint silvery line, almost hidden by his dark hair. It all crashed down on him with the force of a physical blow. Silas Cain was Caleb Vance. The boy he had pulled from the fire, the child whose family he had failed to save. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a reckoning. The stable fire wasn't about land. It was a performance, a piece of theater designed to echo the past. Framing Anaba, an innocent caught in the blaze, was a cruel reenactment of his family's fate. The carved bird wasn't a clue. It was a signature. Every move Kane had made from his arrival in Bitter Ridge to the public shaming of Jed was a deliberate, meticulously crafted act of vengeance. He hadn't come to build a town. He had come to tear one down, starting with the man he blamed for the destruction of his entire world. Jed looked up from the telegram, his eyes scanning the street. He saw Kane step out of his office, pausing to speak with Sheriff Brody. Kane placed a reassuring hand on the sheriff's shoulder, his expression one of concerned civic duty. He was a chameleon, a monster, wearing the skin of a savior. And now the monster knew that Jed knew. The game had changed. The pretense was over. It was no longer a chess match. It was a hunt, and Jed had just become the prey. The nervous sweat on the telegraph operator's face told him everything. Kane had been told the moment the message arrived. He had been waiting for Jed to read it. He was letting Jed see the full scope of the trap just before he sprang it. The trap snapped shut with brutal efficiency. Kane didn't wait for Jed to make a move. He preempted him, twisting the narrative so completely that the truth itself became a weapon against him. The key was the stable boy, a young waif named Timmy, who had been sleeping in the hayloft the night of the fire. He was the only person who could have seen who really set the blaze. Jed had been trying to speak with him, but the boy was terrified, hiding from everyone. Kane got to him first. Sheriff Brody found Jed in the blacksmith shop, his face grim. "Jed, I need you to come with me. There's been a killing." They found the boy's body in the narrow refuse-strewn alley behind the general store. Timmy lay in a heap, his eyes wide with a final silent terror. A single deep wound in his back was the cause of death. Protruding from the wound, its familiar staghorn handle unmistakable in the dim light, was Jed's own skinning knife. Fletcher and two of Kane's men were already there, their expressions a perfect blend of shock and grim satisfaction. "Found him just like this." Sheriff Fletcher said, his voice heavy with false gravity. He pointed a thick finger at the knife. "That there is Stone's blade. Seen him use it 100 times. It was a perfect frame." Jed had been seen trying to talk to the boy. Now the boy was dead, and Jed's knife was the murder weapon. The whispers and suspicions of the town instantly hardened into absolute certainty. Jedediah Stone wasn't just an Indian lover. He was a cold-blooded killer. "Jed, Sheriff Brody began, his hand hovering near his pistol. The betrayal and confusion on his face were genuine. "It's a lie, Eli," Jed said, his voice dangerously calm. He didn't look at the body. He looked past it down the alley toward the main street where Silas Kane was now standing, watching the scene unfold with that same detached reptilian calm. "He's been setting this up from the start. All I know is what I see." Brody said, his voice hardening with the pressure of the moment. "And I see your knife in a dead boy's back. I have to take you in." Jed knew that if he went back to that cell, he would never leave it alive. Kane would see to it. A mob, an accident, a quiet shiv in the night, the methods were irrelevant. He had to run. "I'm sorry, Eli," Jed said, and then he moved. He shoved the sheriff aside, not with violence, but with enough force to send the older man stumbling. He vaulted over a stack of rain barrels and sprinted down the alley, the shouts of "Stop him" erupting behind him. His first thought was Annaba. She was the reason this had all started. She was the living symbol of Kane's twisted play, and he couldn't leave her to face the town's fury alone. He circled around the back of the buildings, his movements swift and silent, a ghost in the twilight. He reached the jailhouse, found the spare key hidden under a loose stone, a relic of his martial days he'd noticed Brody still used, and let himself in. Anaba was on her feet instantly, her eyes showing no surprise, only a grim understanding. "They are coming," she said. "I know," Jed replied, unlocking her cell. "Kane framed me for murder. We have to get out of town, now." They slipped out the back as the posse led by Fletcher and bankrolled by Kane was forming in the main street. They liberated Jericho and another sturdy-looking mare from the corral and rode hard out of Bitter Ridge, the sounds of the baying mob fading behind them. They fled into the vast, unforgiving emptiness of the Wyoming Badlands, a stark landscape of eroded rock and shadow. The moon rose a pale-scarred witness to their flight. They were fugitives now hunted by a posse that believed them to be monsters, while the real monster sat on his throne, the undisputed king of Bitter Ridge. The Badlands were a crucible. By day, a relentless sun hammered down on the sere, cracked earth, baking the air until it shimmered. By night, the temperature plummeted, and the wind howled through canyons and gullies like a mournful spirit. For 3 days, Jed and Anaba moved through this hostile world, pushing themselves and their horses to the brink. Jed was a master of this terrain. He knew how to read the land, how to find water where none seemed to exist, how to use the broken landscape to mask their trail. Anaba, for her part, was just as resilient. She moved with a quiet endurance, her knowledge of the natural world a perfect complement to Jed's tactical skill. She found edible roots and used herbs to treat a cut on Jed's arm that was beginning to fester. They spoke little, their communication pared down to the essentials, but a deep, unspoken trust grew between them in the shared hardship. On the 4th day, from a high, wind-swept mesa, they saw them. The posse, a string of dark figures miles behind them, relentless and implacable. Fletcher was leading them, his bulk visible even from this distance. "They're gaining," Anaba stated, her voice flat. Jed nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon. A storm was coming. Not of rain, but of dust. The sky to the west was turning a sickly, bruised yellow-brown. The air grew heavy, static, and tense. A sandstorm. A sirocco of the plains. Most would see it as a threat, a blinding, choking cataclysm. Jed saw it as an opportunity. "We're not running anymore," he said, turning to her. "We're going back." Anaba looked at him, her dark eyes searching his. "Back to the town that wants to hang us. It's the one place they'll never expect us to go," Jed explained, his voice low and intense. "Kane won't be satisfied, hunting me in the wilderness. His play is for the town. His stage is Bitter Ridge. That's where this has to end. The storm will be our cover." They rode into the teeth of the approaching tempest. The wind rose from a whisper to a scream, picking up sand and grit until the world was a swirling vortex of brown. Visibility dropped to mere feet. The sun was blotted out. It was like riding into the end of the world. They slipped back into Bitter Ridge under the cover of the gale. The town was a ghost town. Its citizens shuddered in their homes against the onslaught of the storm. Sand piled in drifts against buildings, and the wind howled through the streets, tearing at signs and shutters. They left the horses in a sheltered arroyo and made their way on foot to the one place Jed knew Kane would be waiting, the half-finished courthouse. It was the symbol of Kane's new order, the monument to his corrupted justice. The structure groaned under the assault of the wind. Sand seeped through the gaps in the unfinished walls, coating everything in a fine layer of grit. Inside, lit by the frantic swinging light of a single lantern, Silas Kane stood waiting. He was not alone. Fletcher and Peters, the man with the limp, stood with him, rifles in hand. "I knew you would come back." Marshal Kane said, his voice cutting through the roar of the storm. He no longer sounded like Silas Kane, the sophisticated businessman. His voice was laced with the raw, undiluted hatred of Caleb Vance. "A man like you can't just run. Your guilt wouldn't let you. It always brings you back to the fire. This isn't about guilt, Caleb Jed said, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt. Anaba faded back into the deep shadows near the entrance, a silent, watchful presence. This is about stopping you. Cain laughed, a chilling, broken sound. Stopping me? You can't stop me. You started me. You and your righteous law that left my family to burn. His face contorted, the mask of civility melting away to reveal the raging, wounded child beneath. I wanted you to feel it. I wanted you to watch an innocent, that woman, be blamed for a fire. I wanted you to carry that failure, to have it eat you alive just before I killed you. My justice is poetry. Your death was meant to be the final stanza. The storm outside raged, a perfect mirror of the emotional turmoil within the courthouse. Fletcher raised his rifle. Enough talk. Let's end this. And then the world exploded into motion. Jed drew his pistol, the shot deafening in the enclosed space. But he didn't fire at Cain. He fired at the lantern, plunging the room into a maelstrom of shadow and momentary blindness. Fletcher roared and fired wildly into the dark. Peters, disoriented, stumbled. Anaba, moving with silent grace, hurled a heavy carpenter's mallet she had found, striking Peters in the back of the knee. He screamed and went down. Jed tackled Fletcher, the two men crashing to the sandy floor in a brutal tangle of limbs. It was a primal fight, all fists and fury, lit by the occasional flash of lightning from the storm outside. Fletcher was stronger, but Jed was faster and smarter. He used the big man's momentum against him, rolling and twisting until he had the upper hand, ending the fight with a series of concussive blows. Jed rose, breathing heavily, and turned to face Cain. The man stood near the judge's half-built bench, a small derringer in his hand. But he wasn't aiming at Jed. He was aiming at his own temple. You won't take me, Marshal, Cain hissed, his eyes wild. I won't let you put me in a cage. My family died free. So will I. Don't, Jed said, his voice pleading. It doesn't have to end this way, Caleb. The hate, you can let it go. For a fleeting second, Jed saw the lost 12-year-old boy in Cain's eyes. He saw the pain, the fear, the bottomless well of grief. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the cold, hard shell of a man who had let vengeance consume him entirely. It ended 10 years ago, Cain whispered. The roar of the storm swallowed the sound of the shot. As if on cue, the fury of the storm began to recede. The wind's howl softened to a mournful sigh, and the first pale fingers of dawn probed the dusty air. The rising sun illuminated a town, transformed, scoured clean by the wind, yet blanketed in a fine layer of ochre dust. The townsfolk, drawn by the gunshot and the eerie silence that followed, emerged from their homes. They found Sheriff Brody and Doc Miller already there, standing in the doorway of the courthouse. Inside the scene told the whole story. Fletcher and Peters were subdued, tied with rope from a workman's coil. And Silas Cain, or the man they now knew to be Caleb Vance, lay still upon the floor, the cycle of his hatred finally broken by his own hand. The truth, stark and undeniable, settled over the crowd. The whispers started piecing together the fragments they had witnessed: Cain's quiet machinations, Fletcher's bullying, Jed's unwavering defense of an innocent woman. Shame was a heavy blanket silencing the angry, accusatory voices. Their eyes turned to Anaba, no longer seeing a savage, but a woman who had endured their scorn with a quiet dignity they could never hope to match. Later that day, as the townsfolk began the slow work of digging their lives out from under the sand, Jed sat with Sheriff Brody in his office. The room felt different, as if the storm had swept away the stale air of compromise along with the dust. He told me everything, Jed said, his voice weary. He finally recounted the full story of the Vance tragedy, not the clean official version, but the messy human truth of it. He He spoke of his hesitation, of the suffocating guilt that had been his constant companion for a decade. It was a confession he had owed for 10 years, a burden he had carried alone until this moment. Brody listened without interruption. When Jed finished, the sheriff poured 2 glasses of whiskey, his movements slow and deliberate. He pushed one across the desk to Jed. "Sounds to me like you were a good marshal caught on a bad day." Brody said, his voice raspy with emotion. "We all have 'em. The difference is, you never stopped trying to make it right. You carried that weight. Kane. He let it turn him into a monster." He raised his glass. To burdens laid down. Jed picked up his glass, the amber liquid catching the light. He drank the whiskey, a welcome fire in his throat, burning away the last of the cold shadows that had clung to his soul for so long. Weeks passed. Bitter Ridge began to heal its wounds, closing with the slow, steady progress of a community rediscovering its heart. Construction on the courthouse resumed the sounds of hammers and saws, a hopeful rhythm promising a future built on a sturdier foundation. Anaba found her place. She worked alongside Doc Miller, her deep knowledge of herbal remedies and healing proving invaluable. The townsfolk, once her accusers, now sought her out, their respect for her growing with each passing day. She was no longer an outsider. She was a part of the town's fragile, recovering soul. Jed knew his time there was done. He had sold his small ranch to a young family, eager for a new start. He was no longer running from his past, but he was not meant to be a man who put down deep roots. His peace was found in motion, on the open range, under a wide sky. On the morning of his departure, he rode out of town, but not toward the open plains. He guided Jericho to a quiet, wind-swept hill overlooking the valley. There, beneath a solitary gnarled cottonwood, were 4 simple, unmarked graves. The Vances. He had buried them here himself all those years ago. He dismounted and stood before the weathered wooden markers for a long time. The wind whispered through the prairie grass, a sound like a long, slow exhalation. From his saddlebag, he took a small object and knelt in the dirt. It was the carved wooden bird, the one he had recovered from Kane's effects. With a gentleness that seemed at odds with his calloused hands, he placed the small totem on the packed earth of the oldest grave, that of Caleb's father. It was a silent apology, an act of remembrance and a prayer for forgiveness for the family, for the boy they lost, and finally, for himself. He mounted Jericho and rode away, without looking back. As he passed the edge of town, he saw a small group of people standing by the road, Sheriff Brody, Doc Miller, and even the blacksmith, his face etched with a quiet, hard-won respect. They didn't wave or call out. They simply watched him go, a silent collective acknowledgement of the man who had faced his own ghosts to save them from theirs. Jedediah Stone rode toward the horizon, a solitary figure against the vast, endless canvas of the West. The sun was warm on his back, and for the first time in a decade, he felt no weight upon his shoulders. He was not a marshal, not a rancher, not a fugitive. He was just a man finally free riding toward whatever came next.